Jasmine's gesture of kindness. The sun had just begun to set, casting a golden hue over the city as the bus rumbled down its usual route. Inside, the atmosphere was typical. Passengers engrossed in their own worlds. Some scrolled through their phones, their faces lit by the soft glow of their screens, while others gazed blankly out the windows, lost in thought. Jasmine sat near the middle, headphones in, her mind floating somewhere between the music and the long day she had just endured at school. At 16, Jasmine was used to the monotony of public transportation. It was part of her daily routine. She was a bright girl with big dreams, but sometimes the weight of life's expectations and the unkindness of the world around her felt heavy on her young shoulders. But today, something was different. As the bus approached the next stop, an elderly woman slowly boarded. She was hunched over slightly, clutching the worn leather handbag, her thin frame barely able to support her as she gripped the handrail for balance. Jasmine's eyes were immediately drawn to her. She noticed how the old woman's knuckles widened as she clung tightly to the metal pole, swaying slightly with every jolt of the bus. No one else seemed to notice. Jasmine scanned the passengers nearby. Not a single person offered their seat. People were too caught up in their own worlds, too engrossed in their screens or too busy pretending not to see. Jasmine's heart sank. How could people be so indifferent? She felt a sharp pang of empathy as she watched the elderly woman struggle to stay upright. Without a second thought, Jasmine pulled her headphones out, stuffed them in her pocket, and stood up. She took a few steps toward the elderly woman, her mind set on a single act that, to her, seemed so simple, yet so important. "Excuse me, ma'am," Jasmine said softly, gently touching the woman's arm. The elderly woman looked up, her eyes tired but kind. "Would you like my seat?" The woman blinked in surprise, as though she hadn't expected anyone to notice her, let alone offer their seat. Her wrinkled face softened into a warm smile. "Oh dear, that's very kind of you. Are you sure?" "Of course," Jasmine replied with a smile. "Please, take it." The elderly woman, whom Jasmine would later learn was named Mrs. Evelyn Anderson, slowly lowered herself into the seat, sighing with relief as she settled in. "Thank you, young lady," Mrs. Anderson said, her voice full of genuine gratitude. "These old bones aren't what they used to be." Jasmine smiled again, gripping the handrail as she stood. "It's no problem at all, Mrs. Anderson. I'm happy to help." As Jasmine stood nearby, she noticed the other passengers around them. Some glanced up, perhaps embarrassed that they hadn't acted. Others remained glued to their phones, completely oblivious to what had just transpired. Jasmine shook her head slightly. How could people be so indifferent? But Jasmine wasn't the type to dwell on negativity. Instead, she felt a warm glow spreading through her chest, a sense of quiet satisfaction. She had done something good, something kind. It was a small gesture, but it had made a difference in Mrs. Anderson's day. As the bus continued on its journey, Mrs. Anderson looked up at Jasmine, her eyes twinkling. "I don't believe I caught your name, dear." "It's Jasmine," she replied, her smile widening. "Well, Jasmine," Mrs. Anderson said, "your kindness has brightened my whole day. It's so rare to see young people like you being so thoughtful." Jasmine felt a rush of warmth at Mrs. Anderson's words. She had always believed in the power of small acts of kindness, but hearing it affirmed by someone else made her heart swell with pride. "I'm just glad I could help." The bus began to slow as it approached the next stop. Jasmine noticed Mrs. Anderson rummaging through her bag, her hands trembling slightly as she fumbled with something inside. Jasmine watched curiously, wondering if the elderly woman needed help again. But before she could ask, Mrs. Anderson pulled out a small, crumpled piece of paper. "Jasmine, dear," Mrs. Anderson called out, her voice barely audible over the rumble of the bus engine. "Could you come here for a moment?" Jasmine carefully made her way back to Mrs. Anderson, holding onto the seats for balance as the bus jostled slightly. When she reached the elderly woman, Mrs. Anderson pressed the crumpled note into her hand, her eyes twinkling with a mysterious gleam. "This," Mrs. Anderson said softly, "will change your life." Jasmine blinked, confused. She looked down at the crumpled piece of paper in her hand, unsure of what to say. Before she could respond, the bus lurched to a stop, and Mrs. Anderson slowly rose from her seat, clutching her handbag tightly. "This is my stop," Mrs. Anderson said with a smile. "Take care, Jasmine. And remember, sometimes the most unexpected things can lead us to our dreams." With that, Mrs. Anderson shuffled off the bus, leaving Jasmine standing there, clutching the mysterious note. As the bus doors closed and the vehicle started moving again, Jasmine stared at the crumpled paper in her hand, her mind racing. What could it be? She wondered. A lucky charm? A secret recipe? Or maybe just the ramblings of a kind but forgetful old lady? Her curiosity was piqued, but something inside her told her not to open the note just yet. The bus was still crowded, and she felt a strange sense of protectiveness over this unexpected gift. Instead, she carefully tucked the note into her backpack, her mind buzzing with questions. As the bus rumbled toward her stop, Jasmine couldn't shake the feeling that something important had just happened. Mrs. Anderson's words echoed in her mind. "This will change your life." But how? And why? Jasmine was a practical girl. She didn't believe in fairy tales or magic. But there was something about Mrs. Anderson, something about the way she had said those words, that made Jasmine wonder. Maybe, just maybe, this crumpled piece of paper held the key to something extraordinary. As she stepped off the bus and started walking toward home, Jasmine couldn't help but feel a sense of excitement bubbling up inside her. Whatever this note was, it had set her on a path, one she was both eager and nervous to follow. Little did Jasmine know, her life was about to change in ways she could never have imagined. The mysterious invitation. The rest of Jasmine's evening passed in a blur. Even as she completed her homework and helped her mother with dinner, her thoughts kept drifting back to the note Mrs. Anderson had handed her. Each time she glanced at her backpack where the crumpled paper was tucked away, a flutter of excitement and nervousness coursed through her. Jasmine was practical by nature, someone who valued logic over mystery. She wasn't the type to be swayed by cryptic words or superstitions. But there was something about Mrs. Anderson, something in the warmth of her smile and the conviction in her eyes, that made it impossible for Jasmine to ignore the note. As she lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, Jasmine couldn't shake the feeling that she was on the cusp of something bigger than herself. Could the note really change her life, as Mrs. Anderson had claimed? Or was it just the rambling of an elderly woman trying to show her appreciation for a simple act of kindness? Eventually, the pull of sleep became too strong, and Jasmine drifted off, the note still resting in the back of her mind. The next morning, Jasmine woke up earlier than usual. She found herself standing at the foot of her bed, staring at her backpack. Today was the day she would finally read the note. She grabbed her bag and pulled out the small, crumpled paper with trembling hands. Taking a deep breath, she carefully unfolded it, half expecting the contents to be nothing more than a vague thank you, or perhaps even an odd bit of poetry. But when she saw what was written, her heart skipped a beat. In neat, shaky handwriting, the note read, "Please visit me at 172 Greenbrier Lane. I have something for you." Below the address, there was a simple postscript: "Bring an open mind and a courageous heart." Jasmine blinked in disbelief. A shiver ran down her spine, and for a moment she felt a pang of unease. Why would Mrs. Anderson invite her to her house? They had barely spoken, aside from Jasmine offering her seat. Was this just a gesture of gratitude or something more? Her mind raced with possibilities. Was Mrs. Anderson lonely and simply looking for company? Or did she have something extraordinary to share? Perhaps it was a family heirloom, or a secret that had been passed down through generations. Whatever it was, Jasmine knew one thing for sure: she had to find out. That afternoon after school, Jasmine found herself standing in front of her best friend, Lily, recounting the events of the previous day. As she spoke, Lily's eyes grew wide with curiosity. No way, Lily gasped, leaning forward across the cafeteria table. She gave you her address and told you to come over. That's like something straight out of a movie. Jasmine shrugged, trying to play it cool, but the nervous excitement bubbling inside her was hard to contain. I don't know, Lily. It feels a little strange, doesn't it? What if this is all some kind of misunderstanding? Lily grinned mischievously. Or what if it's something amazing? I mean, come on, Jasmine, how often does stuff like this happen? A mysterious old lady gives you a note and invites you to her house. It sounds like the start of an adventure. Jasmine bit her lip, uncertainty clouding her thoughts. She knew Lily had a point. It wasn't every day that life handed you an opportunity for something extraordinary, but she couldn't help but feel a little hesitant. After all, she barely knew Mrs. Anderson. But what if it's dangerous? Jasmine asked, voicing her deepest concern. I don't even know her. What if she's not who she seems? Lily's grin faded, replaced by a thoughtful expression. You're right. It could be dangerous. But you said she seemed nice, right? And she didn't give you any weird vibes. Jasmine nodded slowly. Yeah, she seemed really sweet. Grateful, even. And she said the note would change my life. Lily's eyes lit up again. See, there you go. Maybe she wants to give you something special. Or maybe she has a story to tell you, something life-changing. You won't know unless you go. Jasmine stared down at the note, running her fingers over the shaky handwriting. Part of her wanted to ignore it and go on with her life as usual. But another part, an increasingly louder part, was drawn to the mystery. She had always been the type of person who played it safe, who stuck to the rules and avoided taking risks. Maybe this was her chance to break free of that mold. Okay, Jasmine said finally, her voice resolute. I'll go. Lily clapped her hands together, her face glowing with excitement. Yes, I knew you would, but you're not going alone. I'll come with you, just in case. We'll go tomorrow after school. Jasmine couldn't help but smile at her friend's enthusiasm. Having Lily by her side made her feel more confident about the decision. Together, they could handle whatever awaited them at 172 Greenbrier Lane. The next day, Jasmine's nerves kicked into overdrive as the school day dragged on. She kept replaying her conversation with Lily and imagining what they might find at Mrs. Anderson's house. Was this just a harmless gesture from a kind old lady, or was there something more? Each scenario she envisioned only deepened her curiosity. When the final bell rang, Jasmine met up with Lily, who was practically bouncing with anticipation. They both grabbed their bags and set off toward Greenbrier Lane, the address scribbled on the note guiding their path. As they walked, the bustling sounds of the city slowly faded away, replaced by the quiet rustle of trees and the soft chirping of birds. Greenbrier Lane wasn't far from their school, but it felt like another world entirely. The houses were old, with ivy crawling up the sides, and the street was lined with towering oak trees whose branches formed a canopy overhead. It was the kind of neighborhood that felt frozen in time, untouched by the fast-paced world outside. Jasmine's heart pounded as they reached the house. Number 172 was a small, weathered cottage with a white picket fence and a garden full of blooming roses. It looked peaceful, almost too peaceful. Well, Lily said, glancing at Jasmine. This is it. Jasmine hesitated for a moment, then squared her shoulders and took a deep breath. She could feel her pulse quicken as they approached the front door. What lay beyond that door? What did Mrs. Anderson want to share with her? With one last glance at Lily for reassurance, Jasmine raised her hand and knocked. For a moment, nothing happened. The sound of their knock echoed in the stillness of the afternoon. Then, slowly, the door creaked open. There stood Mrs. Anderson, looking just as kind and warm as she had on the bus. Her face lit up with a smile the moment she saw Jasmine. "Ah, Jasmine, you came," Mrs. Anderson said, her voice soft, but filled with genuine warmth. "And you brought a friend. Wonderful. Come in, both of you." Jasmine and Lily exchanged a glance before stepping inside. The air inside the house was thick with the scent of roses, and the walls were adorned with framed photographs of what seemed to be family members from different generations. There was a comforting aura in the room, like stepping into a forgotten treasure trove of stories and memories. Mrs. Anderson gestured for them to sit in the living room, which was filled with cozy, well-worn furniture. "I'm so glad you could come," she said, settling into an armchair opposite them. "I've been waiting for this day for a long time." Jasmine's curiosity deepened. "What do you mean?" Ours. Anderson leaned forward, her eyes twinkling with mystery. "There's something I need to give you, Jasmine. Something that has been passed down for generations. And now, it's your turn to receive it." Jasmine's breath caught in her throat as Mrs. Anderson reached into a small wooden box beside her and pulled out an old, delicate envelope sealed with red wax. "This," Mrs. Anderson said softly, "will change your life." Jasmine stared at the envelope, her heart pounding in her chest. Whatever lay inside, she knew it was the key to unlocking the mystery that had been tugging at her since the moment she met Mrs. Anderson. And in that moment, she realized her life was about to take a turn she could never have anticipated. Unveiling the legacy. Jasmine sat frozen in the soft armchair, her eyes locked on the fragile envelope Mrs. Anderson held out to her. The room around her seemed to fade away, and all that remained was the thudding of her heart in her chest and the delicate envelope in the elderly woman's hands. The wax seal on the envelope shimmered faintly in the dim light of the room, casting a sense of mystery that seemed to thicken the air. "Go on," Mrs. Anderson urged gently, her voice soothing yet filled with expectation. "Open it. There's nothing to fear." Jasmine glanced at Lily, who sat beside her, equally mesmerized by the weight of the moment. Lily's eyes sparkled with excitement, her curiosity as intense as Jasmine's apprehension. With trembling hands, Jasmine reached out and accepted the envelope. The paper felt ancient beneath her fingers, as though it had been preserved for decades, waiting for this precise moment. She turned it over, studying the wax seal, a simple, elegant mark of a rose with a vine wrapped around it. She took a deep breath and broke the seal, the soft crackle of the wax echoing the quiet room. Carefully, she unfolded the yellowed paper inside, her eyes scanning the neat, flowing script. "To the one who shows kindness to strangers, may this gift guide you to the path you are destined to walk. Within these walls lies a treasure, but not of gold. The true wealth you will find is of the heart. Follow the rose, and your legacy will unfold." Jasmine frowned, reading the words again and again, trying to piece together their meaning. A treasure, a path, and what did it mean to follow the rose? "Is this a riddle?" she asked, looking up at Mrs. Anderson. Mrs. Anderson smiled warmly, her eyes twinkling with wisdom. "In a way, yes. But it's more than that. It's a guide, a starting point. You see, Jasmine, there are things in this world that go far beyond what we can see or understand at first glance. Some people are born into legacies they cannot yet fathom. And some, like you, are chosen by fate." Jasmine exchanged a bewildered look with Lily, who was now leaning forward in her seat, hanging on Mrs. Anderson's every word. "What do you mean by chosen?" Jasmine asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mrs. Anderson sighed softly and leaned back in her chair, as if the weight of her next words required her to rest. "The rose you saw on the envelope is no ordinary symbol. It represents a lineage, one that stretches back generations. My family has guarded a secret for many years, a secret that has now been passed down to you. This house, this legacy, it is part of something much larger than you or me." Jasmine felt a chill run down her spine. She had heard stories of hidden legacies and forgotten histories, but she had never imagined she could be connected to one. "But why me? I don't understand." "You were chosen because of your kindness," Mrs. Anderson said softly. "You offered your seat to a stranger when no one else did. That simple act of compassion was a signal to those who came before you, to those who watch over this legacy, that you were ready. Kindness, Jasmine, is the key to unlocking many doors. Lily shifted beside Jasmine, her eyes wide with amazement. So, what happens now? Do we have to solve the riddle? Mrs. Anderson nodded, her gaze focused on Jasmine. Yes, but it's more than just solving a riddle. You must follow the rose. It's not just a symbol. It's a map of sorts. The rose will guide you to what you seek, but it's up to you to find it. Jasmine's mind raced. A map, a treasure, a legacy. This all felt surreal, like something out of the stories she used to read as a child. And yet, the gravity of Mrs. Anderson's words weighed on her, urging her to believe that this was all very real. How do I start? Jasmine asked, her voice trembling slightly. This is it, Mrs. Anderson said softly, motioning toward the door. This is where your journey truly begins. Jasmine pulled the key from her pocket, her hands trembling slightly as she inserted it into the lock. For a moment, nothing happened. The door stood still, as if waiting for some unseen signal. Then, with a soft click, the lock turned, and the door slowly creaked open. The air inside was cool and musty, as though the room beyond hadn't been opened in years. Mrs. Anderson stepped back, allowing Jasmine and Lily to step through the doorway first. Beyond the door was a small, dimly lit room. It was lined with old wooden shelves, each one filled with carefully stacked boxes, dusty books, and objects wrapped in cloth. At the center of the room was a small wooden table, and sitting on the table, bathed in the soft glow of the overhead light, was an intricately carved wooden box. The box was beautiful, covered in ornate patterns of roses and vines, much like the vase on Mrs. Anderson's mantel. It radiated an air of mystery and importance, as though it had been waiting for this very moment for centuries. Jasmine's heart raced as she approached the table, her eyes locked on the box. "Is this the treasure?" she asked quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Mrs. Anderson smiled from the doorway, her eyes filled with a knowing gleam. "In a way, yes, but it's not what you think. The true treasure lies within you, Jasmine, and this box will help you find it." Jasmine glanced at Lily, who was standing beside her, wide-eyed with anticipation. She reached out and gently lifted the lid of the box. Inside was a single rose, its petals deep red and perfectly preserved, as though it had been plucked from a garden only moments ago. Next to the rose was an old leather-bound book with gold lettering on the cover that read the legacy of the rose. Jasmine carefully lifted the book from the box, her hands shaking with a mix of excitement and nervousness. "What is this?" she asked, turning to Mrs. Anderson. Mrs. Anderson stepped forward, her expression serious but kind. "That book contains the history of the rose legacy, a secret that has been passed down through generations. Each person chosen to carry this legacy has added their own story to its pages. Now, it is your turn to continue that tradition." Jasmine stared at the book, her mind racing. The weight of what Mrs. Anderson was saying was almost too much to comprehend. She had never imagined that her simple act of kindness on the bus would lead to something like this, a secret legacy, a responsibility passed down through time. "But why me?" Jasmine asked, her voice barely audible. "I'm just a regular girl. I don't have any special powers or anything." Mrs. Anderson smiled gently. "The legacy isn't about powers, Jasmine. It's about heart. You showed kindness to a stranger without expecting anything in return. That is the true mark of someone who is worthy of carrying the legacy. The rose represents love, compassion, and the courage to face the unknown. Those who carry the legacy must embody those qualities." Jasmine swallowed hard, her eyes still fixed on the book. "What am I supposed to do?" "You must write your own story in the book," Mrs. Anderson explained. "The legacy is not a single path, but a series of choices that each guardian makes. The rose will guide you, but you must decide how to use the gifts you've been given. The path won't always be easy, but you have the strength within you to follow it." Jasmine nodded slowly, her mind spinning with 1,000 thoughts. She looked down at the preserved rose, its vibrant red petals seeming to pulse with life. Somehow, she knew this was only the beginning of a much larger journey, one that would take her far beyond anything she had ever imagined. Lily, who had been quiet up until this point, suddenly spoke up. "Wait, so does this mean Jasmine is like part of some secret society now? What's the next step?" Mrs. Anderson chuckled softly. "Not a society, my dear. It's more of a family, one that transcends blood and time. And as for the next step, that's up to Jasmine. She must decide how to use the legacy she's been given." Jasmine's mind was a whirlwind of emotions: fear, excitement, curiosity, and doubt, all swirling together. She had never asked for this, had never imagined that her life would take such a turn. But now that the path had been laid before her, she couldn't help but feel a strange sense of destiny. "I'll do it," she said finally, her voice steady. "I'll carry the legacy." Mrs. Anderson's face broke into a warm smile. "I knew you would." That evening, after they had returned home from Mrs. Anderson's house, Jasmine sat on her bed, the leather-bound book resting in her lap. She opened it to the first page, where the names of past guardians of the rose were written in elegant script. Each name was followed by a short passage, a story of how that person had used the legacy to make a difference in the world. As Jasmine read through the stories, she felt a deep connection to the people who had come before her. People who had lived in different times and places, yet had all been united by the same symbol, the same responsibility. When she reached the last page, she saw that it was blank, waiting for her to write her own story. With a deep breath, Jasmine picked up a pen and placed it to the paper. The rose had chosen her, and now it was her turn to leave her mark on the legacy. As she began to write, a new chapter in her life unfolded, one that would take her on a journey she could never have predicted, a journey filled with challenges, discoveries, and the power of kindness. And so, with the pen in her hand and the legacy of the rose guiding her, Jasmine began her story, knowing that this was only the beginning of something far greater than herself. The path of the rose. Jasmine had never been one to believe in destiny. She had always seen life as a series of choices and circumstances, not some grand design. But now, sitting on her bed with the ancient leather-bound book on her lap, she couldn't help but feel as though something far larger than her had pulled her into this strange and mysterious legacy. She glanced at the rose once again, its petals as vivid and pristine as the day it had been placed in the wooden box. It seemed impossible that such a delicate thing could have survived for so long, unchanged by time. Jasmine ran her fingers over the soft petals, feeling the weight of its significance press against her heart. For the next few days, Jasmine tried to carry on with her life as usual, going to school, doing her homework, and hanging out with Lily. But her thoughts were never far from the legacy Mrs. Anderson had introduced her to. The idea of being part of something so secret, so ancient, filled her with equal parts excitement and fear. She continued to pore over the book in the evenings, learning more about the people who had come before her. Each story was different, yet all were tied together by one common thread: the rose. Every guardian had faced a choice, a test that forced them to confront their deepest fears and their true selves. Some had used the power of the rose to bring peace to divided families. Others had stood against injustice, guided by the symbol of compassion that the rose represented. And now it was her turn. But Jasmine felt unprepared. How could she possibly live up to the legacy of those who had come before her? She was just a regular girl, with regular problems, and she wasn't sure she had the courage or wisdom to make the right decisions when the time came. It was on one of these nights, as she sat by her window gazing out at the starry sky, that the first sign appeared. It was late, and the house was quiet. Jasmine had been reading through one of the more recent entries in the book, a story about a woman named Isabel who had lived during the civil rights movement. Isabel had used the legacy to stand up for her community, organizing peaceful protests and sheltering those in need. Her strength and determination were inspiring, and Jasmine couldn't help but wonder if she would ever have the courage to do something like that. As she pondered Isabel's story, a flicker of movement outside caught her attention. She leaned closer to the window, squinting into the darkness. At first, she thought it was just the wind rustling the bushes in her front yard. But then she saw it again, a faint, glowing light, just outside the garden gate. Jasmine's heart skipped a beat. She had never seen anything like it before. The light was soft and ethereal, almost like the glow of a firefly, but larger and more constant. It hovered near the gate for a moment before slowly drifting toward the edge of the garden. Without thinking, Jasmine jumped up and grabbed her jacket, throwing it over her shoulders as she rushed out the front door. The cool night air hit her skin as she stepped onto the porch, her eyes locked on the strange light. It flickered and danced, like a tiny beacon calling her forward. She followed it. The glowing orb moved steadily, leading her down the quiet street and into a small park at the edge of the neighborhood. Jasmine's footsteps were soft on the grass as she trailed behind it, her breath quickening with each step. The further she went, the more the world around her seemed to fade away, leaving only her and the mysterious light. Finally, the orb stopped in front of a tall, old oak tree at the center of the park. The tree was ancient, its gnarled branches stretching high into the sky, casting long shadows in the moonlight. The light flickered once, twice, and then disappeared, leaving Jasmine standing alone in the darkness. For a moment, she felt a wave of disappointment. Had she just imagined the whole thing? Had her mind conjured up this strange encounter because of her obsession with the legacy? But then, as she looked closer at the base of the tree, she noticed something that made her breath catch in her throat. Carved into the bark of the oak tree was a rose. It was small and simple, just like the one etched on the door in Mrs. Anderson's house. Jasmine reached out and touched it, her fingers tracing the delicate lines of the carving. The bark was rough beneath her touch, but there was something about the symbol that felt alive, as if it pulsed with hidden energy. A sudden sense of clarity washed over her. This was a sign. The rose was leading her here, showing her the way forward. Whatever journey lay ahead, it had already begun, and this tree, this symbol, was part of it. Jasmine took a deep breath and stepped back from the tree. Her heart raced with excitement, and her mind buzzed with questions. What was she supposed to do now? Was this another test, like the ones the previous guardians had faced? As she stood there, lost in thought, she heard a voice behind her. "Beautiful, isn't it?" Jasmine spun around, startled by the sudden intrusion. Standing a few feet away was a man she hadn't noticed before. He was tall, with dark, weathered skin and sharp eyes that seemed to glimmer in the moonlight. He wore a simple, faded jacket and jeans, blending into the night like a shadow. Jasmine's instincts told her to be cautious, but something about the man's calm demeanor put her at ease. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice steady despite her surprise. The man smiled, a soft, knowing smile that sent a shiver down her spine. "I've been watching over you, Jasmine." Her heart skipped a beat. "Watching me?" He nodded, stepping closer. "You're the new guardian, aren't you? The one Mrs. Anderson chose." Jasmine swallowed hard. "How do you know that?" The man's smile widened. "I was a guardian once too. A long time ago. The rose chooses us, Jasmine, but it's up to us to decide how we walk the path it shows us." Jasmine's mind reeled. A former guardian. She had never considered the possibility that others might still be out there, watching over the legacy. "What do you want from me?" "I'm not here to ask for anything," the man said gently. "I'm here to help. The legacy is not a burden to carry alone. You will face challenges, just as I did, just as every guardian has, but you don't have to face them without guidance." Jasmine felt a mixture of relief and confusion. Guidance? What kind of challenges? The man's expression grew serious. "The world is full of darkness, Jasmine. It always has been. The rose has always represented light, hope, and kindness. But there are those who would try to extinguish that light, who would twist the legacy into something it was never meant to be." Jasmine's chest tightened. Are you saying someone will try to stop me?" The man nodded. Perhaps not immediately, but the moment you accepted the legacy, you became part of something much larger. You'll have to be careful who you trust. Even those who seem kind may have their own agendas. Jasmine's mind raced. She had known that becoming a guardian of the rose would be a challenge. But this was more than she had bargained for. "What should I do?" The man stepped forward, placing a hand on her shoulder. "Trust the rose, Jasmine. It will guide you. And trust yourself. You were chosen for a reason. Remember that." Before she could respond, the man turned and began to walk away, disappearing into the shadows as quickly as he had appeared. Jasmine stood there for a long moment, staring after him. Her mind was spinning with questions, but one thing was certain. This was no ordinary legacy. There were forces at play that she had yet to understand, and the challenges ahead would be unlike anything she had faced before. But she wasn't alone. She had the rose, and she had the strength within her to follow its path, no matter where it led. With a deep breath, Jasmine turned back to the carved rose on the tree. The night was still, the air thick with anticipation. Her journey had only just begun. The test of the heart. Jasmine stood alone in the park, staring at the carved rose on the ancient oak tree, the night air cool against her skin. The encounter with the mysterious man had left her shaken, yet filled with a sense of purpose. She had been chosen for something far greater than herself, a legacy stretching back generations, tied to kindness and compassion, but also to a darkness she had yet to fully understand. As she walked back home, under the blanket of stars, her thoughts were heavy. The weight of the responsibility now felt real, tangible. The rose, the carved symbol in the tree, and the man's warning echoed in her mind. "You'll have to be careful who you trust." What did that mean? Could there truly be people who would try to stop her? Jasmine had always believed in the good in people, but this legacy had already shown her there was more to the world than she could see. By the time she reached home, her resolve had strengthened. She needed to understand more about the rose, about the legacy, and about the challenges that awaited her. The answer, she knew, lay in the book Mrs. Anderson had given her. The ancient text held the stories of those who had come before, their triumphs, their failures, and most importantly, their wisdom. Jasmine sat at her desk, the leather-bound book open in front of her, the delicate rose still resting in the box. She ran her fingers over the embossed lettering on the cover, her heart racing as she turned to the next blank page. Her name had yet to be written there, but she knew that soon enough it would be. Her story, her legacy, would take its place among the others. The room was silent as she began to read once more, the flickering light of her desk lamp casting soft shadows on the walls. This time, she found herself drawn to a passage near the end of the book, a story that seemed to call out to her. It was the tale of a young woman named Elijah, a guardian from centuries ago. Elijah had been chosen much like Jasmine, her kindness marking her as worthy. But her journey had been filled with hardship, betrayal, and a test that had nearly broken her spirit. As Jasmine read, her heart began to pound faster, the words on the page drawing her into Elijah's world. Elijah's test. Elijah had been a healer, known throughout her village for her gentle nature and selflessness. The rose had chosen her because of her unwavering compassion, but as with every guardian, she soon faced her test. One cold winter evening, a traveler arrived in the village, a man with a dark past and a heart heavy with bitterness. He sought shelter, and though others had turned him away, Elijah welcomed him into her home without question. She offered him food, warmth, and kindness, believing in the power of compassion to heal even the deepest wounds. But the traveler's heart had been poisoned by years of anger and loss. He saw Elijah's kindness not as a gift, but as a weakness to be exploited. Over the days that followed, he began to sow seeds of distrust among the villagers, whispering lies about Elijah's motives, twisting her every good deed into something sinister. The villagers, once grateful for Elijah's healing hands, began to doubt her. Rumors spread like wildfire, and soon, even those closest to her turned their backs. Elysia, heartbroken and confused, could not understand how her acts of kindness had led to such betrayal. One night, the traveler confronted her. "Why do you continue to help these people?" he sneered. "They've turned on you. They don't deserve your kindness." Elysia stood firm, her heart aching, but her resolve unshaken. "Kindness is not something we give because we expect something in return," she replied. "It's a choice we make, no matter how we are treated in return." The traveler's face twisted with anger. "They don't deserve your compassion. They deserve to suffer for what they've done to you." Elysia looked at him, her eyes filled with sadness. "Perhaps, but I will not let their actions change who I am." And with those words, Elysia passed her test. The rose bloomed once more, and the darkness that had surrounded her faded away. The traveler, seeing the strength of her heart, left the village, and the truth of his deception was revealed. The villagers, filled with shame, begged for her forgiveness. But Elysia, true to her nature, forgave them all, her heart as pure as it had always been. Jasmine closed the book, her heart heavy with the weight of Elysia's story. It was clear now. Every guardian faced a test, not of strength or intellect, but of the heart. The true challenge was not in fighting some external enemy, but in remaining true to the values the rose represented: kindness, compassion, and love, even when the world seemed determined to crush them. But Jasmine still didn't know what her test would be. Would it be a single moment, like Elysia's confrontation with the traveler? Or would it be something more subtle, a slow erosion of trust and hope? The uncertainty gnawed at her. A soft knock on her bedroom door startled her from her thoughts. She quickly closed the book and turned to see her mother standing in the doorway, a warm smile on her face. "Hey, sweetheart," her mom said, stepping into the room. "I just wanted to check on you."